JSON Web Tokens, JWT, are a standard for representing claims securely between two parties. They are typically used to authenticate users and authorize their access to certain resources. In this tutorial, we'll see how to implement JWT authentication in a .NET 7 Web API using Entity Framework. Special shout out to Adele. Thank you for sponsoring this channel. For those who like to sponsor the free content, the link is in the description below. So here we are in Visual Studio. We're going to go to create new project. We're going to select the ASP.NET Core Web API C#. We're going to call this JWT demonstration.api. We're going to hit next. The framework will be 7. We shall configure for HTTPS. We shall use controllers and we shall enable OpenAPI support, and we shall click create. We'll start by installing the necessary Nuget packages for our project, and the first one is going to be the one that allows us to use JWT. So click on your project, go to manage Nuget packages, .ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT bearer. Go ahead and install this. Then we shall install Entity Framework Core. We shall install the core itself. We shall install the design. And then SQL Server to allow you to talk to a SQL Server database. And we're going to install tools to enable us to run migrations. These packages will provide us with the necessary tools to implement JWT authentication and use Entity Framework to manage our users. We'll create a model for our users. So click on the project and click add new folder, call that data. Within the data, create another folder, call that models. And inside the models, create a class, call that user. The user class will include username and password. We'll use the field to authenticate and generate the JWT tokens. So since we use a database, then we will have a primary key, that will be the ID. Then we shall have username, followed by password. Create a database context to manage our use. So under data, create a folder, call that context. And we shall call this application DB context class. So application DB context. So the context is going to inherit from the DB context. Okay, bring in Entity Framework Core, and it will include the DB set for the user because you want to create that, as well as some seed data that you want to use to enable you just not focus on putting the users in. So it takes a constructor. The constructor takes in a DB context options, which takes in the name of the class. In our case, the name of the class is application DB context. Application DB context. Give it the options. And let's give also the options to the base as well. Okay. So we want to have, in our case, as we're making our DB, we want to have the DB set of the user. So bring that in. Bring the user in. Control dot, bring in the models. And our table name is going to be called users. And we want to create, to seed in some data so that as we make our database, we're going to have some data. So we just focus on the JWT. So we're going to override on modelCreating. And then we're going to get the model builder here. I'm going to say model builder. And get the entity user and make sure it has data. All right, so it has data, and we just put in one user. That will be new user. ID going to be 1, username going to be admin, very secure, and the password is going to be admin. So we have that. Next step is to configure database connection string in the JWT configuration. So we need to configure the connection string for our database, and this is done in the app settings of JSON. So we're going to bring in, by default, it comes connection strings, and we'll just call that default connection. So default connection, and we're going to use the one that comes with Visual Studio, the SQL Server. So server, we're going to use the local DB so that you don't spend time installing a lot of things. SQL local DB, like so. Then the name of the database is going to be JWT DB demo, and for faster connection, we'll just make that equal to true. So this will be equal to true. So there we've configured our entity framework to talk to the database at this side. The next thing we need to do also is to configure for the JWT, because there'll be things that we also need to do. So when I have JWT, then you're gonna have what you need: an issuer. That could be, we just put HTTPS. Localhost.com, and you're gonna have an audience. We could just repeat the same, and we do have the key, which we actually use for the actual encryption. So this could be whatever is unique to you. I'll just do something in shortcut here. I'll just create a GUID just to put there, but you should put your key over there, and there you have it. Next, we'll configure Entity Framework and JWT Authentication in the program.cs class. So we're going to go there. The first thing we need to do is add Entity Framework. So add Entity Framework. So since it's a dependency in API, so we have to, like I said, in this services, under this dependency injection container. So you say, give me the services, give me the builder, and on top of the services, I want you to add a DB context, and the context we have is an application DB context, like so. And then, as you saw it takes an options. So we want to give the options. Then we're going to say options. We want to use SQL Server, and we'll get the builder dot configuration. That's where we access the app settings, and then there's a function called get connection strings, which is very, very key in this scenarios. And we'll just give it the name of the connection, which is default connection. So there we have our entity framework configured. Next, we need to configure our JWT configuration. Again, we're gonna write on our builder services, and we're going to say we want to add authentication. And like so. But within that, we'd like to bring in more options which we're going to use. So we're going to say options, and we'll say on that options, we want you to add there a default authentication scheme, and this would be from the JWT bearer defaults, and just bring in the authentication scheme. Also on the options, we want you to add a default challenge scheme. A default challenge scheme is a scheme that Microsoft uses for authentication, and you shall use JR JWT bearer defaults, and then it shall also go to the authentication scheme. And once we are done here, we're going to add now the actual JWT to the service. So we're going to say dot add JWT bearer, and within there we're going to close that up, and we're going to bring in also another options, which means we'll also chain into this. And once we do that, we're going to bring what we call the token validation parameters, which just adds and just gives more claims and more identity to whoever is going to get the bearer. So on the options, we're going to add a token validation parameters, and it will be a new token validation parameters. And within that object, we're just going to qualify it with what we want to have. So we want to validate the issuer, we want to validate the audience, we want to validate it in a lifetime so that it doesn't expire, and we also want to validate the signing key. And we also want to know who the valid issuer is. So valid issuer is going to be, we want to access now these two, the issuer and the audience we had set here. So we want to access those via the configuration. So we're going to say builder to configuration, and this comes pre-default there. You're going to say go find JWT, which is this, and within that get us the issuer. So it will go there and it will get you that. We want to do the same for the audience. So valid audience will be builder to configuration, and we're going to say JWT, and the audience is just audience. So I'm copying and pasting to avoid making mistakes. It's very, very critical. Then we want to issue a signing key. So for you to issue a signing key, we just bring in the symmetric security key. So the symmetric security key is going to help us with that. All right, so to have that, we need to have some encoding, and we need to bring in this class from the system text, then push it to UTF-8, then we have to get bytes. And for you to encode, you want to sign with a key. And we're going to write on the builder because the key is also in our appsettings.json. You're going to say configurations, and within those configurations, then you want to get the JWT, and you want to get your key, like so. I think at that juncture, we could say that we are done. So we've added JWT and Entity Framework to our configurations. The next order of business is to add it to our pipeline. So as you can see here, we have authorization, but now we want to add authentication. So authentication comes before authorization. So we're going to add authentication, or rather use authentication. Authentication, like so. So we're saying whoever hits our pipeline, make sure before you authorize them, they have to be authenticated. Next, we'll create an authentication controller. So this will handle our user login request. And once somebody has been logged in, then we will issue them the actual token. So I will delete whatever came with this API. Then remove the controller and the weather focus class. And I'm going to add a controller. Make sure it's an API controller. Make it empty. And we'll call this auth or authentication, whatever serves you right. And then you're gonna hit add. So for you to authenticate somebody, you need to go to the database. So I know I haven't done the migrations yet. I'll do them once I finish here. But you need to access two things: the user, which is Entity Framework, and you need to access also the key, which is here. So to access the key, like you've seen in the program.cs, we use the configuration on the builder. So we'll do the same here. We'll go to our controller, and we're going to inject this dependencies in the controller. So we're going to say application DB context for the context, and we also need to have the I configuration. So those two will give us access to the database and the JWT files respectively. So let's bring in the field for that. Like so. I love to put underscores for easy distinction between the two. But you could do whatever works in your use case. Then we're gonna have an HTTP post request because we want to talk to the database and create something. So that's then we're gonna have a public async task return action result. Then we'll say login. But the thing is, if you look at the model we have here, it's user. It has a word code ID, which we don't want to use because this is auto incremented. So what you'd want to do here is to have another model called a login model, which just have things that you want to use. So I'll call this login model, and all you need to have is just this two. So this is like your DTO, like so. So that when somebody wants to be authenticated, they can just use the login model. Which will make it easier. So login model. Nice. Then we can just try to see if the model state there is valid. If it's not, then just return a bad request. If not, then let us proceed to go to the database and find the users and then try to authenticate them. So we're going to check if the user exists. So for you to check, then we have to store that in a user model, in a user object. Then we'll check our context. Then context will say get us the users. First for default, where you is going to go to u.username. This has to equal to login model.username and u.password equal to login model the password. And we also perform a check. If the user is null, if the user doesn't exist, then obviously that one you have to return not authorized, right? Rather unauthorized. They should know that they are not authorized to go there. If they pass there, then we need to create the token. So first of all, you need to have a few claims. So a claim is just you telling it, this is who I am, that's my identity. So it's a matter of integrity. So we're going to start up with a few claims. So our claim is going to be a new claim. So we're going to say new claim. We're going to use a JWT, like say claim names. This will be our sub. And I will just take our username, which we've gotten from the user, and we're going to get the username. Then we're going to have a new and final claim for this. It'll be the same JWT, like the claims. This time around will be a JTI. And we just create a new guild. So I put track new guild, new guild, and we just push that to string. So that's our claim. This will be enough to know who is making that claim to our API. Then we need to have a signing key. So let's have a signing key. We're going to use the same thing we used there, a symmetric security key. and then we'll have to encode that to bytes. We're going to make use of overbar the encoding here, and then we're going to bring it into text. We'll push that to UTF-8, and we'll say get bytes. And now we need to access the configuration for that thing in our appsettings.json. So configuration, we're going to say fine. We want to do JWT and get us the keys one. Is it keys or key? Key. Sometimes copy and paste does help. And once we've, so that gives us our signing key. Now we need to have the signing credentials. So which the signing key will now be essential for the signing credentials. So you're going to have the signing credentials. Signing credentials will be equal to new signing credentials. And what you give to the credentials is your signing key and your hashing algorithm. So we're going to use the security algorithm, which is the HMAC SHA-256. And there you go. So once you do that, now you have to actually now create the actual token, which now will be given to the user. So var token could be a handful. Var token is equal to new JWT security token. And here we're going to give it an insurer. JWT security token. And this is not an object as it is. This is all right. So we're going to say I'm going to have an insurer. Again, configuration. We're gonna go there and get a JWT, and we're gonna get our issuer there, like so. And might as well go close up. Then we're gonna have, if you guess it, audience, configuration, JWT. We need audience, and we'll put it there. Then it also need to have claims. Good thing we've got our claims on top of there, which we've already done, and we're just gonna and give it that. Then this thing needs to expire, because if it's for life, then that becomes a problem. So expires, we're just gonna give it 7 days for now. We say datetime now. Datetime now. And maybe add days. Let's give it 7. Like so. And finally, you're gonna need to have the sign-on credentials. And we have the one on top there. And finally, once we finish this, I wonder why there's an error. Why are we having an error? Okay, it wants to fully qualify that. Once we've done that, then we could return an OK. So return an OK. And within that, we're going to return an anonymous object. We're going to go new. Then return new score token is equal to a new JWT security token. JWT security token handle, which has a function called write token, and you're going to give that token. And that is it. So yeah, might be a handful, but this is what you're going to use to authenticate whoever wants to come, and you're going to use this to write to them the token. So we don't have a database yet. You're going to go to tools, then Nuget package manager console, and add migration. Call this initial. Press enter. And let's see what's done. So it's going to create a table called users identity. It's going to auto increment, and we have that thing we had put just to have it seed at runtime. Then to have the database, you're just going to update database. Okay. So how would you know that somebody has been authenticated and given access? So we've got the database there. Then we're going to have another endpoint, another controller. We're going to call it secure controller. So we want that whoever has access has been authenticated can now access this controller. So let's create this. It's going to be called secure controller. Okay, but to begin with, I'm going to secure it so that you see what happens when we bring in the control. So I'm going to say HTTP GET. Then we could say public actions like GET, and let's just return. Okay, we'll call this is secure. So let's see what this will do before we do our actual authentication. So I'm going to IS Express, and I'm going to run this. And if I hit the secure get there, try it out, and I hit it, it will say this is secure. So I can access it without authentication. Let me go see if I can authenticate myself, and I'm going to say admin and admin. Let's see what happens. You see that I get the token, but you see that Swagger here doesn't give you a place to put the token. So there's something we do to enable it, but it's not part of this scope. So what I've done is I'll just copy and paste the code that can be used for that. So this code is used to add to the Swagger so that it enables you to add that authentication. So I'm going to stop this. I'm going to go to the program.cs, and underneath this, I'm just going to bring in Swagger. So all it does is it just says, okay, add Swagger. I'm just put my name, my email, and I've added the bearer to enable you to use the JWT format. And to protect this secure controller, there's one thing you do. All you do is just put a decorator there and call it authorize. Authorize. If you do this, this becomes protected. So let's go ahead and run that. If I go now and say get that, it is going to say 401, which means unauthorized. But if I go and authorize myself, and I put admin there, and I put admin there, it gives me back a token. Now if I copy this token and go top here, see whatever we've done to the code has brought that, and put bearer plus a token and authorize that, it means I have logged in. Then if I go here and execute that, lo and behold, I've gotten this is secure. And you see that in the request, there's a header code authorization bearer, which now gives me access to that. So if you've managed to reach this far, congratulations, you have learned how to implement security within your APIs. Thank you very much.